anything right.
I'm sorry, my daughter.
Don't call me that. Kofi, get up!
The room went quiet, too quiet. Abina didn't scream. Not because she wasn't in pain, but because the kick had knocked every bit of air out of her aging chest, as if someone had grabbed her last breath and crushed it until nothing was left. She collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. The impact made a dull, hollow sound, one sharp beat, then silence. The ceiling spun above her clouded eyes. Her ears rang, as if the entire house were being dragged under deep water. She tried to inhale. The air was there, but it refused to enter her lungs. Only a faint, broken wheeze caught in her throat, burning like a dull blade. Her hand reached out by instinct, not to defend herself, but to find something familiar. A chair, a piece of fabric, a hand. But the concrete was cold. Cold as if it had been waiting for her all along. In front of her stood Saad, a younger woman, dark-skinned and gleaming under the yellow light, hair tightly braided, eyes sharp as razors. Saada's foot hadn't fully come down yet, the tip of her sandal still hovering in the air like a suspended threat. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't panicked. There was no explosive anger on her face, only the cold irritation of someone who had just swept away what she considered trash. Abina looked up, and in the brief moment their eyes met, she felt something more painful than the kick itself. Saad didn't see her as human. Saad curled her lips slightly and bent down, as if speaking more clearly, as if the old woman on the floor were deaf and needed commands shouted into her face. "Are you pretending again?" Saad said, her voice cold as stone. "Get up," she continued, each word dropping like pebbles into still water. "Stop acting," Abina wanted to protest. She wanted to say, "My child, I'm not pretending. I'm just old. I'm just in pain." But her throat wouldn't obey. Her chest spasmed, tightening and collapsing with each breath, as if someone were stepping on it. Her hands trembled against the floor, fingers clawing into the concrete as if clinging to life itself. And behind Saad in the shadow where the living room wall met the hallway stood Kofi, her son. Kofi didn't move forward. He didn't shout. He didn't push Saad away. He stood there like a wooden post, broad shoulders rigid, his face frozen in the kind of silence people wear when they don't know who to choose. Abina looked at him, searching desperately for a sign. Panic, a step forward, a single cry. "Mama!" She had heard that word hundreds of times in her life. When Kofi fell into the muddy pond as a child. When malaria burned through his small body. When he ran home waving his school papers. Mama! That word had once been the thread tying her to the meaning of her entire existence. But now, there was no mama. Only Kofi's eyes looking down dark and deep like a well. She saw his lips tremble, as if he wanted to speak, as if he wanted to intervene, then press shut again. A dry swallow. A breath held back. He looked at Saad, then at his mother, then at the floor, as if he were staring at a stain that had appeared in his house. Abina wanted to believe he was afraid, that he was stunned, that he just needed 1 second, just one more second to step forward and help her up. She wanted to believe that, with all the stubborn faith of a mother who had lived on belief alone. Kofi had once been a barefoot boy running across the yard, crying and clutching his stomach from hunger. Abina had broken the last piece of yam in half, given him the larger portion, and lied. "I'm full." She had stood in the crowded market in Abadan, shoulders bent under heavy loads, sweat burning her eyes, still smiling when people called out, "Mama Kofi," because in that name she heard pride. She remembered the day Kofi left for Lagos. She pressed a worn cloth bag into his hands. Inside it, a few coins, a small Bible, and a frayed handkerchief. "If you miss me," she said, "touch the cloth." Kofi held her tightly, crying, "I'll come back. I'll bring you to live with me. I promise." A promise, bright as early season sunlight. Fragile as cooking smoke, Kofi did come back, but not as the boy he once was. He returned in new clothes, polished leather shoes, a glowing phone in his hand. And with him came Saad, a woman who entered Abina's house as if it were someone else's temporary shelter. From the day Saad arrived, Abina was slowly pushed aside from her familiar chair, from the living room, from conversations. She began hearing whispers. That old village woman, she embarrasses us. Why does she just stay here? Abina tried to endure. She told herself, as long as my son is happy, it's enough. I'm old. I can bear a little. She gathered each word like shards of glass, trying not to let them cut her heart. But she never imagined there would come a day when a single kick would turn all that endurance into a wall, one that sealed every path back. Saad glanced at Kofi, her lips curving into a smile thin as paper. See? She said calmly. She does this every time. Kofi didn't answer. Abina saw his hand clench, then release. As if he were wrestling with himself, and losing. Please. Abina tried to speak, but the word never fully formed. It came out as a faint rasp trapped in her throat. Saad shrugged and looked back at Abina like she was a nuisance. If you can breathe, you can stand, she said. Abina wanted to cry, but no tears came. She felt her body slipping away from itself, limbs heavy as stone, chest crushed and burning. And the greatest pain wasn't in her ribs or her knees. It was in the place behind her, where Kofi stood, still unmoving. She looked at her son one last time, begging with her eyes. In that look was her entire life. The night she stayed awake by his bed, the day she went hungry and still smiled, the time she was humiliated at the market and came home to hold him anyway. She poured it all into that gaze like sending a final letter. Kofi blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. And in that moment, Abina understood a cruel truth. Some people don't kill you with their hands. They kill you with their silence. Abina opened her mouth, but there was no breath left to speak. Abina had once been a strong woman. Not the kind of strength that comes from power or money, but the quiet strength of a Nigerian woman who knows how to stand upright in life, even when life keeps trying to push her under. In a small village in southern Nigeria, where red dirt clings to bare heels and the sun pours fire onto tin roofs, Abina lived by her own hands. Every morning, before the mist had lifted, she rose from sleep, lit the charcoal stove, tied her headscarf tight, and lifted her goods to the market. Yams, corn, beans, things that seemed small, yet made up her entire world. She walked through narrow paths, old sandals slapping against the earth, the load creaking on her shoulders, her back still straight. At the market, she settled into her usual corner, spread out a worn tarpaulin, and arranged her goods carefully, as if order could make life less chaotic. On scorching days, sweat streamed down her neck, yet she smiled as customers bargained. On slow days, she stayed until dusk, not because she expected a miracle, but because she feared going home with empty hands. Because at home, there was a child growing, a child she called her life. Kofi, on rainy nights when water felt like the sky was being torn apart and the market scattered for shelter, Abina was often the last to move. She covered other people's goods first, pulled a tarpaulin over a neighbor's stall, held onto a basket of tomatoes for someone who slipped. And when she turned back, more than half of her own produce was soaked, yams softened, corn lost its color. People called her foolish. Abina only smiled. Because in her heart lived something larger than a few yams. She feared others suffering the way she had, and she believed that a small kindness would one day be returned to her son. All of it was for one reason. One truth she repeated like a prayer whenever exhaustion crushed her, whenever hunger twisted her stomach, whenever her legs felt unable to take another step. My son must be educated. He must not live the life I lived. Those words were more than a wish. They were the rope that pulled her through endless days. They were why she skipped meals so Kofi could eat. Why she sold her only pair of wedding earrings to buy his books. Why she stood outside the school gate, watching Kofi in his worn uniform, her heart aching with pride, aching because he lacked so much, proud because he still walked into class like a child with a future. Kofi grew up inside that sacrifice. He grew up on meals of watery soup and a little corn, always accompanied by his mother's familiar lie, "I've eaten." He grew up with nights where Abina sat under an oil lamp, mending his clothes, eyes burning, hands trembling from fatigue, her voice still humming an old lullaby. Sometimes Kofi woke in the middle of the night and saw his mother curled on the floor, the thin mat not enough to block the cold. "Mama, why don't you sleep on the bed?" he asked. Abina pulled him close, kissed his forehead, and spoke as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "That bed is yours. You need strength to study." She slept on the floor so her son could have a bed. She went hungry so her son could have books. She swallowed humiliation so her son could hold his head high. And Abina believed she was planting something that would never betray her, a mother's love. She believed maternal love was a cord that could not be cut, no matter how hard life pushed. She believed that when Kofi became a man, he would return, take her hand and say, "Mama, I'm taking you away from this place." She believed that if she endured long enough, reward would eventually come. But some beliefs, the more beautiful they are, the more painful they become when they break. She believed a mother's love was something no one could deny. She was wrong. Kofi left the village on a morning that was strangely clear, as if even the sky wanted to pretend the farewell didn't hurt. The red dirt road in front of the house was still damp with dew, clinging to his heels with every step, as though trying to hold him back. Abina stood at the doorway, her headscarf tied tight, her calloused hands gripping the hem of her son's shirt, as if holding on to the last piece of her own life. Kofi was still young then, bright eyes, straight shoulders, a body full of promises. He hugged his mother tightly, his voice rough with emotion. "Mama, I'm going to Lagos. I'll work. I'll send money home. I'll come back and take you with me." Abina nodded. She didn't say much. A poor Nigerian woman understands that a young man's promises can be as thin as cooking smoke, but she chose to believe anyway. Because if she didn't believe, what else was there left to live on? She pressed an old cloth bag into Kofi's hand. Inside were a few crumpled Naira notes she had saved by skipping meals, a small Bible with worn edges, and an old handkerchief. "When you're tired," she said softly, "take out the handkerchief. I won't be there, but I'll be in your hands." Kofi nodded, eyes red. He walked away. Abina stood there until her son became nothing more than a small dot swallowed by red dust and sunlight. Lagos swallowed Kofi the way the sea swallows a grain of sand. The city was too loud, too fast, too cold for someone from a small village. In the early days, Kofi took any work he could find, loading goods at Balagan Market, running deliveries, sleeping in a cramped room with other men far from home. Some nights he lay awake staring at a stained ceiling, listening to traffic thunder outside, wondering if he had been wrong to leave his mother alone. But then life cracked open a door for him, just wide enough to make him believe he had truly escaped poverty. Kofi studied more, worked harder, took risks. He met the right people, found his way into a construction company. His salary slowly increased. His clothes changed. Plastic sandals turned into leather shoes. He began having coffee meetings talking about opportunities, the future, success. And then he met Saad. Saad entered Kofi's life like a bright light cutting through years of struggle. She was beautiful in a way that made people look twice. Smooth, dark skin, sharp eyes, neatly braided hair, a perfume so refined that standing near her felt like standing close to a dream. She dressed elegantly. She spoke quickly, confidently, using words Kofi had only heard on television, never dared to use himself. She talked about the city as if it were a stage she had been born to belong to. Kofi listened and felt himself lifted, as if he were finally stepping into the world he had always wanted. He loved Saad not only for her beauty. He loved the feeling of becoming someone when he stood beside her. They married quickly. Kofi sent a wedding invitation back to the village, its glossy letters shining on thick paper. Abina held the card, her eyes wet. She didn't understand all the English words, but she understood one thing. Her son had a family now. And in her heart, family meant she would be taken along. The day Kofi brought Saad home, Abina woke before dawn. She swept the yard, cleaned the house, cooked the soup Kofi loved most as a child. She wore her best dress, which really meant the one with the fewest tears. When the car stopped at the gate, Abina rushed out like a child. "Kofi," she cried, her voice breaking with joy. She reached up to touch his face, as if to be sure this wasn't a dream. Saad stepped out after him. Her high heels touched the ground, as if this entire village were unworthy of her feet. Her eyes swept over the tin roof, the dirt yard, the old plastic basins, then landed on Abina. A brief look, sharp, cold, like someone examining an object that had lost its usefulness. Abina smiled and bowed politely. "Welcome, my daughter," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. Saad didn't answer right away. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering something, then pressed her lips together and turned to Kofi. "This your place?" Kofi smiled awkwardly. "Yes, my mother's home." From that moment, Abina felt the change, not through words, but through the air itself. Saad wasn't loud. She didn't insult her openly at first. She simply made Abina feel outdated. When Abina spoke, Saad replied briefly. When Abina smiled, Saad didn't smile back. When Abina served food, Saad looked at it like something unfamiliar, took a small bite, and set it down. In the days that followed, Saad began to speak more. But not to Abina, about Abina. To Kofi, right in front of her. As if she didn't exist. "Why is she still here?" Saad asked once, her tone as casual as asking about the weather. "You said you'd take her away." Abina stood right there, washing dishes. Cold water ran between her fingers. She heard every word. Her heart flinched like it had been pricked with needles, but she forced a smile, as if she hadn't heard a thing. Another time, when neighbors came to greet them, Saad pulled Kofi into the room and closed the door, not quite fully. Abina heard Saad's voice drift out. "Looking at her embarrasses me in front of the neighbors. Don't you see how she dresses?" Abina stood outside, her back stiff. She looked down at her old dress. She remembered wearing this same dress when she sent her son to Lagos, believing one day he would take her away from poverty. Now that dress had become evidence of her shame. Kofi heard it. He said nothing. Sometimes he glanced at his mother. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But then he turned away, like someone choosing the safer path. Because he told himself, it's just words, he told himself. Saad was just difficult, that his mother could endure, that silence would keep the peace, avoid unnecessary conflict, prevent a pointless argument. But each time he stayed silent, Abina felt something inside her fall away. Small pieces, quiet pieces, but falling again and again. The more Saad spoke, the more she advanced. The more Abina retreated, the smaller she became. And Kofi stood in the middle, choosing nothing at all, believing himself innocent. He didn't know, or didn't dare to know, that in a house where one person is humiliated and another bears witness, silence is no longer peace. Silence, too, is a form of complicity. That day, Abina dropped the bowl. It was only a small clatter, a lonely sound inside a house already accustomed to heavy silence. The old ceramic bowl, the one Abina had used for years, slipped from her hands as she turned. It struck the concrete floor and shattered, breaking into thin white pieces like eggshells. Abina froze. Her heart jumped, not because of the bowl, but because she knew what would come next. Saad snapped around. Her eyes flashed like a freshly sharpened blade. In that instant, the room seemed to shrink, the ceiling lower, the air thick and heavy. Saad didn't ask what happened. She didn't need confirmation. She looked down at the broken pieces as if they were evidence. "You're completely useless," Saad shouted, her voice sharp and cutting through the room. Abina lowered her head by instinct. It was the reflex of someone who had learned to apologize before even knowing whether she was at fault. She knelt down, her knees pressing against the cold floor. Her old hands trembled as her calloused fingers reached for the sharp fragments. I'm sorry," Abina whispered, so softly it seemed she was afraid even her words might anger Saad further. She carefully gathered the shards into her palms. Blood seeped from her fingertips, but she didn't notice. All she could think about was cleaning it up, quickly, before the anger had time to grow. Saad didn't stop. "Look at what you've done," she said, stepping closer. "You're always causing trouble." Abina didn't look up. She tried to keep her voice calm, tried to make herself smaller, to fade into invisibility, as if obedience alone could make the rage pass. But that rage didn't need a reason to pass. Saad shoved her. Not a hard push, just enough to make Abina lose her balance. She fell sideways. The hand holding the broken pieces slipped, and the shards scraped into her skin. Abina let out a small cry of pain, then quickly swallowed it, afraid that any sound might be seen as defiance. "Get up," Saad said. "Stop pretending." Abina tried to push herself up, but her knees shook. Her back burned with pain. Her breathing suddenly grew heavy, as if something were pressing down on her chest. She looked up. Her cloudy eyes searched for the one thing that could save her from this moment. Kofi. He stood near the doorway, arms hanging stiff at his sides, his face locked into a mask. The light cast his shadow across the floor, stretching over the broken bowl and his mother's thin body. "Kofi," Abina called, her voice hoarse. Just one word. No blame. No resentment. Only the simple plea of a mother who still believed her son was there. Saad turned to Kofi, as if waiting for him to confirm something. "You see," Saad said. "She's always like this, always pretending to be weak." Kofi swallowed. He looked at his mother, then at his wife. Inside his head, thoughts tangled into chaos. "It's just a bowl. My mother can handle it. Saad is just hot-tempered. If I intervene, this will turn into a big scene. If I stay silent, it'll pass quickly." He chose silence. Saad didn't wait. She lifted her foot. The first kick landed against Abina's side. Not strong enough to kill her outright, but strong enough to knock the breath out of her chest. Abina opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The air was ripped from her lungs. The world tilted. "Kofi," she tried to cry, but it came out as nothing more than a painful hiss of air. Saad straightened and looked down, as if checking the result of her action. When she saw Abina still moving, she frowned. "Get up," Saad snapped. "I told you to get up." Then came the second kick. This one was harder. Abina was thrown backward. Her head struck the concrete floor with a dull thud, then silence. Her ears rang, her vision went dark. The house drifted away, as if she were sinking to the bottom of a deep river. Kofi took a step forward. Just one small step, enough for Abina to see it, enough to spark a fragile thread of hope. Then he stopped. Saad glanced at him, a look both challenging and certain, and Kofi, as always, turned away. He could have stopped it. He could have said one sentence. "That's enough." He could have pulled his mother away. He could have placed a hand on his wife's shoulder and said, "No." But he didn't. Saad kicked her again and again. Not in a rush, not in rage. Just like someone kicking an obstacle out of the way. Abina lay still. The shattered bowl lay beside her, white shards mixed with blood. Her eyes were half open, fixed on Kofi. In that gaze there was no fear, no pleading. Only a deep, quiet sadness. The sadness of someone who had finally understood that the place she believed was safest no longer existed. Kofi stood there, his heart pounding wildly. He wanted to believe his mother had only fainted, that she would open her eyes, that things hadn't gone too far. But in the silence spreading through the room, a cold truth slowly took shape. That moment, the moment he stood there and did nothing, took his mother from him forever. Abina died the next morning. There was no wailing horn, no crying echoing from the yard. No one ran to the end of the lane to call the neighbors, the way deaths usually happened in the village. Abina's death arrived quietly, like a door closing in a house already accustomed to silence. Dawn had just broken. Thin sunlight, like a torn cloth, slipped through the doorframe and fell onto the concrete floor where she had lain all night. Kofi sat on a wooden chair facing her, back straight, eyes hollow. He hadn't slept. Not because he was caring for his mother, but because he was afraid. Afraid to look. Afraid to listen. Afraid to name what he had witnessed. Saad lay in the bedroom, turned toward the wall, as if none of this concerned her. From time to time she shifted, fabric rustling softly, then stillness again. No questions. No, how is she? No concern. Everything in the house moved as if the thing lying on the floor were merely an old object waiting to be removed. Kofi stood up when the rooster crowed for the second time. He walked toward his mother. His foot brushed against a shard of the broken bowl left from the night before, a small white piece, stained with dried blood. He bent down and looked at her face. Abina lay there, her eyes half open, as if still trying to look at him one last time. Her mouth was slightly open, as though holding onto words never finished. A darkened smear of blood rested on her lips. Her chest did not move. Kofi reached for her wrist. Cold. The cold shot straight into his heart like a blade. He jerked his hand back as if he had touched fire. For a moment, he stood frozen, unable to breathe. He wanted to scream, to call someone, to turn time backward. But the house remained silent. Saad appeared in the doorway. Her hair was neat, her face calm, like someone who had slept well. She looked down at Abina, then at Kofi, not with fear, but with assessment. As if asking, "Is it done?" Kofi swallowed. His throat burned. He didn't say, "My mother is dead." He didn't say, "I let this happen." He said the easiest sentence, the safest one. "My mother was old." She fell. The words dropped onto the floor like another broken shard. No longer the truth, but sharp enough to keep blood from being examined. Saad nodded. A small, cold nod, like a stamp pressed onto a lie. "Good," she said softly, but clearly. "Don't make it complicated." Kofi looked at his wife. For a moment he wanted to ask, "Did you hear her call me? Do you remember the kick? Do you remember last night?" But he didn't ask. He was afraid of the answers. Afraid of the truth. Afraid he would have to stand up. He stepped into the yard. The sun had risen higher. In the village, life was waking up. The sound of brooms sweeping, children laughing, vendors calling in the distance. Life continued as usual, as if no one had just been erased from the world inside a small house. The first neighbor to arrive was Nika, the woman who often came to borrow salt. She saw Kofi standing at the door, face pale, eyes red from sleeplessness. "Kofi, what happened?" she asked anxiously. Kofi opened his mouth. His tongue felt heavy as stone. He was about to tell the truth. About Saad, about last night. But behind him, Saad stood with her arms crossed, her cold gaze resting on his shoulder like an invisible hand. Kofi heard his own voice come out, soft, even, like reciting a memorized line. "My mother was old." She fell. Nika sighed, covering her mouth. "Oh, Mama Abina." Soon, one person told another. The news spread like wind. But it carried no truth, only the safest version. No hospital, no police, no investigation. In the village, people do not investigate things that could destroy a family. They do not dig into matters that force them to choose sides. They live by phrases like, "Let the dead rest," "Don't cause more trouble." It's their family matter. Everyone knew. Because someone had heard shouting the night before. Someone heard the impact. Someone even saw the door slam and Saad cross the yard with an icy face. But they only watched, then looked away. No one dared to speak, because speaking would shatter their fragile peace. A single word could bring police to the village, courts, questions, scrutiny of their own children. In poverty, people cling to peace the way they cling to their last meal. And sometimes, they trade truth for peace without realizing the price is a human life. Saad began to handle things like a woman who knew what she was doing. She gave orders. "Clean this place," she said calmly. "People will come." Kofi looked around as if hypnotized. He saw the dried blood on the floor, the broken shards, his mother's headscarf lying in the corner. All of it evidence. Evidence that, if gathered, could save his mother from a nameless death, but he didn't gather it. He bent down, picked up the shards, and threw them into the trash. He poured water onto the floor. He scrubbed it until the blood disappeared, until the metallic smell faded, until the concrete looked clean, as if no one had ever fallen there. Saad went into Abina's room. A small, bare space, an old mat, a wooden chest, a few faded clothes. Saad opened the chest and rummaged through it. She pulled out the unnecessary things, the old handkerchief, the worn Bible, a stack of small papers, letters Abina had written to her son but never sent. "Throw these away," Saad said. Kofi stood in the doorway, staring at those items as if they were his mother's life itself. He wanted to keep just one thing. Anything to prove she had lived, had loved, had existed. But Saad held out the trash bag. Kofi reached his hand out, then pulled it back. He watched the letters fall into the bag, heard the rustle of paper, like his mother's final breath, being crushed once more. Abina's room was emptied, as if she had never existed at all. One night, Kofi dreamed of his mother. It wasn't a loud dream. There were no screams, no blood, none of the chaos people imagine when they think of nightmares. The dream came slowly, gently, like a thin mist slipping into a dark room. Kofi saw himself standing in the yard of his old home in the village in southern Nigeria, where the red earth still carried the footprints of his barefoot childhood. Abina stood there. She wore her old, faded dress, her headscarf neatly tied, just like the morning she used to leave early for the market. Her face bore no wounds, no bruises, no pain. She looked exactly like the mother from his most cherished memories, calm, gentle, achingly familiar. She didn't accuse him. She didn't cry, she only looked at him. Her gaze wasn't harsh. It wasn't judgmental. It was deep and still, like the village well Kofi used to peer into on hot afternoons. She looked at her son for a long time, so long that Kofi felt his heart being squeezed tight. Then she asked, her voice as light as wind passing through leaves, "Why didn't you save me?" Just one question. Not why did you let them beat me, not why did you betray me. Only, why didn't you save me? Kofi wanted to answer. He wanted to speak the thousands of excuses that had lived in his head for days, that he was afraid of making things worse, that he thought his mother would be fine, that he never imagined it would go that far. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. Every excuse shrank into something small and cowardly under her gaze. Abina remained where she was, waiting, not urging, not resentful, just waiting. Kofi fell to his knees. They hit the red earth, the same spot where he had once fallen while learning to run, the same place where his mother had lifted him back up. Tears spilled out, hot and salty. He sobbed like a child for the first time in many years. "I'm sorry, Mama," he cried, his words breaking apart. "I was afraid. I was weak. I thought silence would be better." Abina didn't step forward. She only shook her head gently, not in anger, but in sorrow. Then the dream dissolved. Kofi woke up crying. The room was pitch black, no village yard, no red earth. Only the four cold walls of the house he now lived in, the house filled with comforts he once believed was the destination of his life. His pillow was soaked with tears. His heart raced. His throat burned from the name that had escaped his lips unconsciously. Mama. But no one answered. Only silence replied, thick and heavy, like a wet blanket pressed against his chest. His mother was no longer there to hear that apology. From that day on, Kofi's life still looked complete to the outside world. The house was tidy. There was food on the table. His job still brought in money. But inside that house, everything was hollow. In the mornings, Kofi woke up in silence. No familiar voice calling, "Are you awake yet?" No smell of warm porridge rising from the kitchen. He made his own coffee, ate alone, stared at the empty space where his mother's chair once stood. The chair was still there, but empty, like a mute reminder. In the evenings, he came home after dark. No one waited by the door. No one asked, "Was your day hard?" No one urged him to eat more, to wear something warmer. Everything was orderly, on schedule, and terrifyingly cold. Sometimes Kofi flinched at a small sound, something falling, a rush of wind. For a brief second, he thought his mother was still there. Then he remembered, and the emptiness crashed down again, heavier than before. He began avoiding corners of the house, avoiding his mother's old room, avoiding the roads that led back to the village. But the more he avoided them, the tighter the memories clung. Every night, when he lay down, the question from the dream returned, clear as a scar carved into his heart. "Why didn't you save me?" There was no answer that brought relief. Kofi finally understood something, far too late. The greatest cost of silence is not the accusations of others. It is the judgment that never stops inside your own heart. He could keep living. He could smile. He could walk among crowds. But he would forever be the man who stood and watched when his mother needed him most. No one would call him son again. No one would wait for him to come home. Only one cold truth would follow him for the rest of his life. Some mothers do not die because they are beaten. They die because they are abandoned by their own children.